With all of the information that's available to us, how do we find and how do we verify facts? That's really the question that we're going to be addressing tonight. Our starting point at Baruch in our Department of Journalism and the Writing Professions is journalism. And journalism requires locating reliable sources, detecting and screening out spin, hype, and falsehoods, and unearthing newsworthy, accurate information. But law, science, and business also have their own strategies and their own methods for finding facts that might make the difference between, in science, being informed by high-quality research or duped by junk science, or in law, between a fair outcome in a trial and a miscarriage of justice, or in the art business, between buying a valuable work of art and the possibility of buying something that's worthless or even a forgery. With the internet, we all of us, whether we're journalists or regardless of our profession, we all have a role in identifying facts and publishing and sharing information. And we all have access to almost limitless information of all qualities from millions of sources. I'm hoping this cross-disciplinary conversation with this absolutely amazing panel, guided by the legendary and incredible journalist and leader in journalism, Geneva Oberholzer, will help to shed light on a variety of approaches for finding and verifying facts so we can all be more discerning consumers of and contributors to the information we all share, and so we all can be better informed for our own benefit and for the benefit of society. Geneva first, I guess, came to my attention on a panel I saw that Geneva was on. It was a roundtable discussion with Fred Friendly. And just from the get-go, my very first impression of Geneva, and it's the impression I've had for a long time now, is just a natural and incredible leader and inspiration in journalism education, in journalism ethics. All of our bios are attached, but as you'll notice, Geneva's roles have included being the editor of the Des Moines Register, being the ombudsman for the Washington Post, on the board for the New York Times, as well as recently the head of the USC Annenberg School of Journalism.
You know, the kind of triggering concern that galvanized us to do this program was during the debt ceiling crisis, and the many people who were speaking out about what was called, among other things, false equivalence in journalism. And we were talking about how we could advance this discussion beyond the usual little circle of journalists talking about it. And Jean had the wonderful idea, really the animating vision of this program, which is that we should ask people from other fields to think with us about how we separate fact from fiction, about how we try to achieve something as close as possible to the truth. Much has been said, as you know, about false equivalence, and we will say more. As they say in Washington, not everyone has said it. We'll say our bit. But we do want first to go to our extraordinary panel, to whom I am really, really grateful, to ask them to think with us about, in their own fields, what are the methods, really, of trying to get at fact and trying to separate out the not valid from the valid. To my immediate left, Harold Varmus, director of the National Cancer Institute and winner of the Nobel Prize in 1989, and just recently back from India. We're delighted you're with us, Harold. And Jane Aiken, Associate Dean for Experiential Education and Professor of Law at Georgetown. Thanks for coming out, both of you, from DC. Next to Jane is Amy Whitaker, who writes about the intersection of art and business and everyday life and teaches at Sotheby's Institute of Art. And to the far left is Margaret Sullivan, public editor of the New York Times and a longtime friend of mine, former editor of the newspaper in Buffalo. So I'm just going to start with Harold, and we'll go one to the other. And please tell us, as we seek to think about what journalism ought to know from other fields, lessons in truth-finding.
Thank you, Geneva. I'm a natural scientist, and my goal is to observe accurately and try to understand how things work. My own specialty is cancer research, that is medical sciences, and that places a special onus on me and my colleagues because the kinds of things we seek to observe and understand often make their way into the care of human health. So in contrast to a cosmologist who might fail to make a correct distinction between the Earth and so between the sun becoming extinct in 5 million or 5 billion years, an important distinction, but one that doesn't affect daily life. Many things that we determine may seem smaller on that scale, but actually have direct effects on the way human beings live their lives and therefore are often a particular interest to journalists. Our goal is to get things right. People like to make discoveries. They like to be correct. The risk of not being correct is very high, reputationally and in every other way, and especially for those who do medical research. They don't want to make mistakes that lead to things that adversely affect the health of human beings. Well, what kinds of defenses do we have against mistakes? First of all, we all think we rely heavily on the scientific method, and we do. Make observations, they lead to hypotheses. You then design experiments to test them. You collect data, you analyze it, you try to draw conclusions, you try to understand how things work. Then you publish the results. They're subjected to peer review. Your colleagues read the papers. Some of them try to reproduce your findings and building on those findings. And in an ideal world, that all works very nicely. Nevertheless, a lot of mistakes are made, and I thought it might be useful to say something about the kinds of mistakes that are made and who the perps are in making the mistakes. So the first category, one that attracts a lot of attention, is what we call FFP, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. It's a rare category, but it attracts attention because frequently the claims are actually close to being right if you're really a clever person. But this is grand larceny, and when it's exposed, careers end. The second category is what happens when you have inadequate tools to make observations that lead you to the right conclusions. An example is provided by the recent death of Janet Rowley, a great cytogeneticist from Chicago, who played a critical role in moving a field of leukemia research from a time when it was known that leukemia cells of a certain type always had one small, odd, mangled chromosome that people thought was a deleted chromosome. And she was able to use improved technologies, not just to show that the first group was wrong, but that when you looked at it with more precision, you could show that this mangled chromosome was actually a pastiche of two chromosomes fused together in a very precise way. And when that was further studied by yet other people, it was possible to show that those two fused chromosomes were actually fusing two genes in a way that led to leukemia. And now we have a drug that addresses the consequences of that fusion. So you can see how things develop along a series of steps, and that it's not that people were wrong along the way, there's just the information was incomplete, very dependent on methodology. A third category, one that I think journalists are particularly worried about and fall into traps about, has to do with faulty reasoning. That is, making claims based on observations that are really associations rather than cause and effect. And there are many things out there you read about in the paper every day where folks are saying we made a series of observations suggesting that tomato paste protects against prostate cancer, and it turns out to be an association, not really a cause and effect relationship. The fourth, the one that consumes us all at the NIH at the moment, is what I would call sloppiness. And it's sloppiness that's driven by a very competitive atmosphere in which we now live. The resources available for medical research in particular are not adequate to the number of people out there. And the competitive atmosphere that's been created, combined with a need to publish in certain journals to get your work properly acknowledged and for your careers to move forward, is pushing people to take shortcuts in the way they work. And all of us at the NIH are trying to figure out ways to reduce this level of sloppiness, applying more rigid statistics to findings, building checklists so that reviewers and grant applicants have to fulfill certain criteria to show that their work is going to meet a certain standard, and simply a change in the atmosphere so that people are not in a big rush to get things published. But this is a very serious concern for many of us and the source of many errors in current scientific work in my field.
Thank you, Harold. Very clear. Let's move from science to the law.
Oh. Well, in the law, we think of finding truth as the exercise of an adversarial process where one side presents facts and the other side presents facts, and the fact finder, be it a jury or a judge, decides what's the truth. And in fact, it's covered, the trial process is covered by rules. Those rules are the rules of evidence. The rules of evidence purpose says that the reason we find truth is because by finding truth, we can find justice. I teach evidence in law school. In other words, I teach the rules of truth. And if you can say that without smiling when you're teaching these students, then you've accomplished something. Now, the assumption in the adversarial process is that you get two sides present the facts, and then you apply common sense or sometimes some kind of expert opinion, and that the probabilities that you have come to a certain truth is what's decided. And the jury or the judge decides what those probabilities point to. And there's actually a process incorporated in the rules of evidence for how one gets to that truth. And you start with you first identify what is the proposition that you want to prove as true. Then you decide how much evidence do you need for that truth to be determined to be truth, because of course it's never certainty, it's all probabilities. So in a criminal case, it's beyond the reasonable doubt. In most civil cases, it's by the preponderance of the evidence. How much evidence do you need to prove that this is true? Then we go forward and say, now who bears that burden? Who has to prove the truth? So in a criminal case, the prosecutor bears the burden. And if they fail to rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt, there is no truth proven, and therefore the person is acquitted of the crime. Once you've determined what's the issue, who bears the burden, how much do you have to prove, what rules control the evidence? Well, the way we look through the rules of truth is first we have to decide whether the piece of evidence that's being offered is relevant to the proposition that you're trying to prove. Relevant means it makes it more or less likely that that fact is true, this piece of evidence. When we're looking at evidence, it's easy to think about binary evidence. It's either true or false. But in fact, what really is problematic in determining truth is inference. How much inference can you make from this? Is it appropriate, the inference? And we have rules that control the appropriateness of inferences. And you look to see whether the inference that's being taken from this is more prejudicial, unfairly prejudicial, than probative. And we keep evidence out that unfairly is prejudicial. So we have rules about that as well. We are absolutely insistent for lay witnesses that they talk about facts, not opinions, not conclusions. So a witness can't get up and say he was recklessly driving. That's a conclusion, that's an opinion, it's not a fact to be proven. That person, as a lawyer, you deconstruct that conclusion into its component facts. The facts being he was driving over the speed limit, he was moving from lane to lane, the kinds of things that would lead a fact finder to conclude the truth that he was recklessly driving. We also require personal knowledge. The person testifying has to know what they're talking about. And therefore, we have specific rules about hearsay. In other words, words said by someone else that are reported for their truth in court by another. We restrict the use of hearsay to very specific kinds of hearsay that are allowed. All of this comes together to create probabilities. What are the probabilities that this is true? And the job there is to deal with the weight, because probability means weight. And so we have all sorts of rules for uncovering weight. We ask questions to challenge the truth teller. Is the truth teller telling the truth? So we ask about prior inconsistent statements, we ask about contradiction, we ask about prior convictions, prior bad acts that tell us about their truthfulness. We do all of that to try to undercut the weight of the testimony such that that fact becomes less likely to lead to truth because of your concern about whether the person is a truth teller. Now, there are problems with the adversarial process that are built that really don't get handled very well, which lead us to be concerned about truth in the legal profession. One is point of view. If, for example, a group of men are standing on the corner and they see the police walking toward them and they run, can we infer that they have a knowledge of guilt? Or is it more likely that they have an experience with police officers that make them want to run? Those are very different things, and it depends on point of view. And that changes depending on who's hearing this evidence, their experience, and what weight they're likely to give it. We have concern about eyewitness testimony, most of the exonerations that are happening. We believe that when people say they saw what they saw, that they saw what they saw. But in fact, what we're learning is that they may not. And so the law is contaminated by certain things that you think are true, like confessions and like eyewitness testimony, that we give weight to that in fact shouldn't be given weight. We have things that we've decided in the law are more important than truth. For example, coerced confessions, bad searches, family relationships, the privilege of a spouse not to testify against the other. Even though it is likely to lead us to truth, we have decided as a matter of rules that they won't be, that truth is less important when we deal with that. So I'm very happy to be here because I think we don't talk enough about this, and it's a great opportunity.
It already gives me chills. Appropriateness of inferences, faulty reasoning, associations rather than cause and effect. All right, let's hear from art and business.
Yes, so thank you for inviting me to participate. As Geneva was saying, I have a foot in the art world and a foot in the business world, so I thought what I would do is bring three different stories. One from finance, one from customer service or everyday life, and one from the arts. So I think most of us know Twitter and probably know that in November of this year, Twitter was listed publicly on the New York Stock Exchange. So it was the moment where the people who had privately held ownership got to see if they could have a liquidating event and make money from all of their work. So the question is, what is the value of Twitter? How do we know value? And value, I think, foots to truth. And in the finance world, truth is quantitative for the most part. There's a sense of a bottom line profitability. So an income statement where it all funnels through to net income or profit for a firm. And when a company like Twitter goes public, people look at the net income of the firm. So for Twitter, their net income in the 6 months prior to the IPO had been roughly $21 million through the eyes of management. But in actual fact, there are many different ways that people report net income. One of them is called EBITDA, which is a fun word to say. It's an acronym for earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And what it means at a personal level is I could think about the profit that I make in my life if I pretended that I never had to pay tax, that I never had to pay interest on any money that I had borrowed, and that if I buy a computer once every 5 years, I don't have to save up for it. It just kind of magically happens. And there are many uses for EBITDA. It allows you to compare companies apples to apples, independent of their financial situation. But basically, in the case of Twitter, there were several different earnings numbers, and one through the eyes of management was $21 million, and through the eyes of an accountant was a loss of $69 million. So what happened was Twitter listed for roughly $25 the first day of trading. I think it was 26. And then the price in that day of trading went up to $44.90. And now Twitter trades for about $64. So why is that? It's because people have made projections about the future that are based on the past or based on the future, and that are the application of stories to the study of numbers. So there are many people who, and much as in science, try to come up with the right metrics and the right time frames over which to consider those metrics. So are you looking at quarterly earnings and profitability, or are you looking at long-term creation of growth? Are you believing that Twitter is so instrumental to how we live that no matter if they have losses now, we should all want to be investors? They're not necessarily answers to these questions, but they get at kind of how truth is known in a financial setting. So that's the first story. And the second story is I had to cancel a flight with US Airways, or let's say an airline that should remain nameless in the context of this story.
But we have an idea.
They actually were lovely about it in the end, but I knew that I couldn't fly, so I canceled it. And then the day before the scheduled flight, I received quite a number of emails from an airline offering, you can tell I don't study law, offering me the opportunity to check in for a flight. So I thought, this could be a problem. And so about an hour before the plane would have taken off, I, at an inconvenient time, called US Airways and said, hey, I canceled this. And they said, no, you didn't, because we don't have a record of the cancellation. So ultimately it was fine, and I spent what an economist would call contracting cost and monitoring cost time to follow up with a multinational corporation. But there's an interesting question that foots to law about the burden of proof. Because for them, they have whole departments that are tasked with dealing with this and whole computer systems that are considered to represent the truth. For me, I just had a story about the fact that I called them and canceled it, and that inside my own life, there is a logic to that I knew that I couldn't fly on that particular day. So how do we reconcile the truth of individual experience versus the truth of large interests? That could be the truth of voters versus the truth of political process. It could be the truth of a defendant versus a situation in which their case is seen. It could be an individual patient with an idiosyncratic history versus the probabilities and statistics of medicine. So that is my second story. And the third is just to think a little bit about how that happens in the arts. So I have the interesting task of teaching finance and economics on a Wednesday after, on a Tuesday night, a painting will have sold for $120 million. Or $48 million at auction. So when that happens, how does that price come about? Is that a true value for a work of art, or is that what happened in the room because of a talented auctioneer and two people who really, really wanted it and had pockets that were that deep? So I think in the case of art, it particularly calls the bluff of finance on knowing the value of things, because by definition, art has some sort of value that is above and beyond what the market can price. And then, of course, the market tries to price it in. But what I really think about that's closer to home when I think about value in the art really goes back to the same questions of Twitter, which is that you're really dealing with stories and numbers. And numbers always look true. Just heuristically, they look accurate by their nature. But in any complicated finance equation, there's usually at least one number that's made up that's based on a story. You could say it's based on an evidence-based argument, but it's based on a story, and it's also based on a probability. So if you look at museums, you look at how many people go in a year, and you have a metric that's an attendance metric, but actually what you're missing is how happy those people are when you're there. You have one number, but you don't have the other number. So you can't come to a kind of understanding of the truth of their experience, and it puts you in an interesting nexus of the quantitative and the qualitative that seems to come up in some of these other stories.
So Margaret, I'm sure you're agreeing with me that we could easily take on all of these and make journalism much better.
That's right.
We're going to start with your purer look at what journalists try to do before we get down and dirty later on and start critiquing it. So give us a sense
Journalists
of
are so seldom called pure.
Pure,
that I'm enjoying them.
Give us a sense of who we are hoping to be.
That's right. Well, I would say of all the disciplines represented here, journalism may be, I guess, what I would call the most inexact science. It's not really much of a science at all. And it's very dependent in many cases, if not most cases, on sources. And so the important thing with most journalism that's not observed directly, some journalism is observed directly. You may be at the scene of a fire or at Tahrir Square or someplace else, but most journalism is based on sources, and so the accuracy of the sources is what is the problem and the issue. So these days, the equation has gotten considerably more difficult because in the digital age, we are putting out information just as quickly as we possibly can, and accuracy has definitely taken a beating as that's happened. We saw that. I'll just use two examples from the past. It's a little over a year now, and these were both breaking news events in the northeastern United States. One was the terrible tragedy in Newtown, and in that situation, there was no warning of it. It happened very quickly. Journalists go into this sort of overdrive mode, and in the digital age with Twitter and all sorts of digital means of putting information out there, a great deal was gotten wrong. And I will remind you, it's funny how we sort of get past these things, but in the initial few hours or first half day of this terrible shooting of young children, a suspect was named. And the problem is that his name was gotten wrong. And it turned out that it was the name of his brother that was being circulated. Well, that's a pretty big mistake. And it is one that, that many news organizations, pretty much everyone, got wrong for a while. The New York Times did not get it wrong in print, but for a brief time, it attributed the wrong name of the gunman online, attributing it to, I think I have this right, to other news media. Nevertheless, it did publish that person's name, and it was wrong. And mistakes really don't get much worse than that. And quickly the news developed, and but even by the next day, there was a front page story in the New York Times, and it also had things that were wrong in it. For example, that the gunman's mother worked at the school, and that somehow he was buzzed in to the school. Well, that turned out to be not to be the case. And so it took time for the truth to develop. And journalism is full of this kind of thing, which is why there's a corrections page that runs every day in the newspaper, and why corrections so often happen. Journalism has been called, and this has been true for a long time, the first rough draft of history. It's a moving target. We get things wrong and then we correct them. These days, it's getting more and more challenging to be right at first, because there's so much competitive pressure. I heard about competition here too. It's interesting how much overlap there is in all of these situations. Your mention of, I hadn't heard this before, but FFP, fabrication, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, is the very reason that the public editor's job exists at the New York Times, because it dates back to the time when a rogue reporter named Jason Blair did those three things. And as a way of trying to guard against that in the future, the Times established this job that I now hold and try to do my best at. The second example I would give, am I going over my time?
No, but I want you to be sure and give us some examples of what journalists seek to do to find the truth.
Yeah, Well, certainly what they seek to do to find the truth is to have accurate sources, to have multiple sources, to have authoritative sources, to have sources that can be held accountable. It helps when you're trying to hold a source accountable if you're using that source's name. And that's something that journalists don't always do very well. They give their sources the cover of anonymity, and it's that much harder to hold them accountable. I think we have to understand the motivations of our sources. What conflicts of interest may they have, or where are they coming from? We have to, when we can, use those sources to inform ourselves so that we can have a certain mastery of the subject. And when we have a mastery of the subject, we're able to challenge what we're hearing. And this is, I think, one of the places where false equivalency comes in. When journalists really don't know anything and they don't have much mastery of the subject, they're much more liable to say, well, he said this and she said that, and we leave you, the reader, to figure out what's true. But when they have some mastery of it, they can challenge that and say, no, you know, actually evolution happened, folks, or climate change exists.
Well, we're going to move on to the specific of false equivalence, but this was so interesting, and I know each of you found each other's interesting. Does anyone have a sort of a question of clarification that you want to seek, or does anyone want to ask anybody for an expansion just real quickly?
I'll just make a quick point about correction. That's a very interesting concept. No, I'm a pretty devoted reader of the corrections column.
It's very interesting.
But in science, we don't have quite the right tools, and in part, it's not so much we don't have them as we don't use them very well, because in fact, as scientists become more familiar with the idea of publishing their work online, often in open access journals or just on a public digital library that NIH maintains, there are tools that allow people to go and say, I tried to repeat that experiment and didn't work, or I take issue with this, but they're not used as much as they ought to be, and in part because of this sense of the possibility that you might offend your colleague, limit his chances by correcting him in public of succeeding, and this reticence, which is not felt in a meeting, congregation of scientists, but it is felt with respect to the written record, which is ultimately the place where things really get hashed out, is a limitation in current science. It really is unfortunate, because I think there's an opportunity here to have a much more open dialogue among scientists. And now when someone is wrong, what usually happens is they just don't get cited anymore, and people are moving in a different direction. People who are in the field know that, but a naive person, your son coming to the NIH, might pick up a paper and not realize that this is a channel of thinking that no longer has credibility, because people have not really registered in a clear way that the correction needs to be made.
Lovely to think that science might actually have something to learn from journalism. Very gracious of you. All right. We're now going to move on to talk about false equivalence, which I'm sure most of you are aware became a very hot topic during the debt ceiling crisis. It has been discussed widely for a long time. James Fallows of The Atlantic is one of the most frequent critics, and he defines false equivalence as the strong tendency to give equal time and credence to varying sides, quote unquote, of a story, even if one of the sides is objectively true and the other is just made up. NYU's Jay Rosen, who many of us know, calls it the innocence agenda. The reporter is a propagandist for a personal conceit. The conceit is that you can report and comment on politics truthfully while always and forever splitting the difference between two sides so as to advertise your own status as perpetually non-aligned. I'm going to read from one of the many critiques that was made. Carl Bernstein wrote one, as you'll recall. This one was in Al Jazeera, so don't let it freight you politically, by a guy named Dan Frumkin, who's written for The Post and others, but I think it succinctly sets forth what the objection was. So this is just an excerpt. U.S. news reports are largely blaming the government shutdown on the inability of both political parties to come to terms. It is supposedly the result of a quote-unquote bitterly divided Congress that failed to reach agreement, those were quotes from the Washington Post, or a bitter budget standoff left unresolved by rapid-fire back-and-forth legislative maneuvers, those were from the New York Times. This sort of false equivalence is not just a failure of journalism, it is also a failure of democracy. The truth of what happened Monday night, as almost all political reporters know full well, is that, quote, this is a quote from The Guardian. We seem to be receiving more illuminating things in this from overseas. Republicans staged a series of last-ditch efforts to use a once routine budget procedure to force Democrats to abandon their efforts to extend U.S. health insurance. Blaming everyone, Congress, both sides, Washington, is simply the path of least resistance for today's political reporters. It's a way of avoiding conflict rather than taking the risk that the public or their editors will accuse them of being unprofessionally partisan. But making a political judgment through triangulation, trying to stake out a safe middle ground between the two political parties, is still making a political judgment, Frumkin continues. It is often just not a very good one. And in this case, as in many others, it's doing the country a grave disservice. So no, the shutdown is not generalized dysfunction or gridlock or stalemate. It is aberrational behavior by a political party that is willing to take extreme and potentially damaging action to get its way, and by not calling it what it is, the political press is enabling it. One final excerpt, a little bit less polemical, not to put Frumkin down, but some of you may have heard an NPR show that David Folkenflik did, beginning with 3 quick sound bites. This one was from ABC's Good Morning. No midnight deal in Washington, just more partisan fights. NBC's Today Show. With lawmakers deeply divided, Americans are feeling the brunt of it. These sound familiar, don't they? Fox and Friends, Republicans still waiting for Senate Democrats to show up at the table. Then Folkenflik said, much, though not all, of the shutdown coverage sounds that way, apportioning equal blame to both parties. Now I'd like to introduce you to 2 journalists who approach their profession very differently in age, outlook, and publication, yet reach similar conclusions about what the story really is. Here's Fallows. The story is one of tensions between one party, the Republican Party, between the Boehner-McConnell traditional faction, and on the other hand, the newly elected Tea Party faction. And Robert Costa of the National Review, which played a very interesting role, at first released the letter that the conservative faction had written to Boehner in the House. I think Speaker John Boehner is the central figure in this entire shutdown discussion. House Speaker Boehner was just unable to get his conference together onto any bill, any legislation to fund the government. And then Folkenflik's point, most of the coverage did not sound like what either of those two on both sides of the political spectrum were saying. So we want now to turn to what our panelists would recommend, sort of applying their guidelines that journalists do in complicated and controversial situations like the government shutdown, to ensure that the public understands what's really going on. But first, let's do a little bit of an exercise to try to place ourselves in a situation a bit more like the one that the journalists were in on the eve of the shutdown by looking at some raw material they had to work with. So we have 3 short clips to show you. 2 are from the president and 1 is from the speaker.
Still some people out there who don't believe that default is a real thing. And we've been hearing that from some Republicans in Congress, that default would not be a big deal. So let me explain this. If Congress refuses to raise what's called the debt ceiling, America would not be able to meet all of our financial obligations for the first time in 225 years. And because it's called raising the debt ceiling, I think a lot of Americans think it's raising our debt. It is not raising our debt. This does not add a dime to our debt. It simply says you pay for what Congress has already authorized America to purchase, whether that's the greatest military in the world, or veterans benefits, or Social Security, whatever it is that Congress has already authorized, what this does is make sure that we can pay those bills. Now, the last time that the Tea Party Republicans flirted with the idea of default, 2 years ago, markets plunged, business and consumer confidence plunged, America's credit rating was downgraded for the first time, and a decision to actually go through with it, to actually permit default, according to many CEOs and economists, would be, and I'm quoting here, insane, catastrophic, chaos. These are some of the more polite words. Warren Buffett likened default to a nuclear bomb, a weapon too horrible to use. It would disrupt markets. It would undermine the world's confidence in America as the bedrock of the global economy. And it might permanently increase our borrowing costs, which of course ironically would mean that it would be more expensive for us to service what debt we do have, and it would add to our deficits and our debt, not decrease them. There's nothing fiscally responsible about that. Now, preventing this should be simple. As I said, raising the debt ceiling is a lousy name, which is why members of Congress in both parties don't like to vote on it, because it makes you vulnerable in political campaigns. But it does not increase our debt. It does not grow our deficits. It does not allow for a single dime of increased spending. All it does is allow the Treasury Department to pay for what Congress has already spent. Unfortunately, some Republicans have suggested that unless I agree to an even longer list of demands, not just gutting the health care law, but things like cutting taxes for millionaires or rolling back rules on big banks and polluters, they'll push the button, throwing America into default for the first time in history, and risk throwing all of us back into recession. I will work with anyone who wants to have a serious conversation about our economic future, but I will not negotiate over Congress's responsibility to pay the bills it has already racked up. I don't know how to be more clear about this. No one gets to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States of America just to extract ideological concessions. No one gets to hurt our economy and millions of innocent people just because there are a couple of laws that you don't like. It hasn't been done in the past, and we're not going to start doing it now. The American people have worked too hard to recover from crises to see extremists in their Congress cause another one. And every day this goes on is another day that we can't continue the work of rebuilding the American middle class. Congress needs to pass a budget in time, pay its bills on time, and refocus on the everyday concerns of the people who sent them there.
So under no circumstances will you pass a clean debt limit?
We are not going down that path. It is time to deal with America's problems. How can you raise the debt limit and do nothing about the underlying problem? George, we've spent more than what we brought in for 55 of the last 60 years. This year, the federal government will have more revenue than any year in the history of our country, and yet we're still going to have a nearly $700 billion budget deficit. We are squandering the future for our kids and our grandkids by not dealing with this problem.
On a sort of a lighter note, this is probably not that you meant it lighter, but your fellow lawyer, Jane, wondered if we should address the fact that is the fact that so many of our politicians are lawyers, reflecting the adversarial nature. Is that part of what we're dealing with here? I mean, it is an interesting question.
Well, I guess the notion that you take two sides and you put facts before the people and have them make the decision is almost the recipe for a false equivalency, and hope that it all comes out. So I guess in that sense, the training of lawyers. Unfortunately, there's no judge there to say this is irrelevant information, which is one of the things that is obvious.
Yeah. So tell us what you think, each of you. I mean, you must be sitting there thinking about your own good examples. How could they have been applied to the kind of coverage you saw, and I quoted? Harold, you must have had
one difference is that in the scientific community, there tends to be a very strong degree of agreement, but it's often, any measure of a dispute, which may not involve scientist against scientist, but layperson against layperson talking about scientific evidence and scientific conclusions, is portrayed with this equivalence. One example is the debate about evolution, another about climate change. One that my wife reminded me of tonight, she's a journalist, is a very important one about vaccines. And it's a debate that we're engaged in very heavily these days because many of us are very concerned that the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is an extremely safe, very effective anti-cancer vaccine that you'd think any parent would want to use to protect their children against getting cervical or oropharyngeal cancer later in life, has been made into an issue by some very revered journalists who think they're airing the debate. That debate, in part, is fueled by an example of FFP, a paper that was published some years ago by a guy named Wakefield in England in Lancet magazine, and is recognized fully by all members of the scientific community to have been fabricated. And that is still cited by a lot of people who say that vaccines are dangerous. Then in India, one of the things that made me, that drove me to go there is that we have a crisis in clinical trials in India, in part because the Indian government closed down a trial of this vaccine a few weeks ago because in a large trial that was actually being funded by the Gates Foundation and carried out by an NGO called PATH, 3 girls among the hundreds of thousands who had been vaccinated died in the trial. It's true they died in the trial. What did they die of? One was in an automobile accident, one fell down a well, and one died in delivery. All completely irrelevant to the vaccine, and put 100,000 people in a trial. Bad things going to happen. So, an example of association rather than cause and effect. But nevertheless, there are people. I mean, even I hate to say this because she's a friend of ours and a friend of the cancer movement. Katie Couric had a show in which there were the debate was aired. Someone who's anti-vaccine, thinks vaccines cause autism, living in the wake of Michelle Bachmann, was accompanied by a woman who had worked at the CDC, who correctly listed some of the problems with the human papillomavirus vaccine. It's very expensive. It doesn't cover, doesn't protect against all types of of papillomavirus, and therefore one still has to go subject oneself to screening. There are going to be better vaccines in the future. It's hard for the parts of the world where cervical cancer is the biggest problem to afford the vaccine, because currently it costs $360 to get a full regimen. So,
but how many ways did Katie go wrong to have that on? I mean, you look at Jane's appropriateness of inferences and probabilities that this is true, and why does this continue to happen, especially on science stories? It maybe goes to your mastery question.
Well, it does, and it also goes to, I mean, I'd like to read you just a sentence from a story not about politics per se, written by David Leonhardt, who's a very smart former Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. One of the easiest sentences for a journalist to write is some version of "both sides do it." And one of the easiest arguments for an advocate to make is a version of "only the other side does it." So we love that conflict, Let's put a guy here and a guy here and have them sort of duke it out. But that doesn't really get to the truth very successfully.
So do you think most Americans knew, I mean, first of all, you may not in this room agree with what we presented as the reality of what happened, but certainly I think it's doubtful whether most Americans saw the picture that essentially is presented here.
Well, that's what I think is so problematic about this false equivalency coverage is it allows for tremendous failures of imagination about future outcomes. So here, what we're really talking about is one side's view of a political process and another side's view of the acceptability of a political process. But what we should be talking about is what will actually happen if we default on a sovereign currency. And I think generally it takes work to imagine the future. So in the vaccine case, you could be saying, well, what will happen if we don't pursue this vaccine research? What is really at stake on that side of the argument? And I think, coming from the business world, if you picked up any investment prospectus, the first sentence on the disclaimer page would say something like, past performance is not an indication of future results, right? Which is probably the opposite of how truth happens in science. And I think it's because we have a really difficult time imagining the future. So I feel that the false equivalency here, if you were trying to create equivalent sides of the argument, they should allow for more conversation about the merits of the debt ceiling conversation itself, so more people in the population at large could have participated in it on the substance of the ideas of, is this important, is it of value, what will happen if we don't do it? Because the model is based on the past, and in the past there's never been a problem with the U.S. defaulting on the debt. And the conversation, the idea that both sides have to be represented in the political process, or this almost legal process, is stopping us from having the more important conversation about a multitude of viewpoints about what could happen and what's really at stake.
But wasn't the debt crisis debate in part a debate about, that was intended to unravel healthcare and,
yes.
and
Right,
undermine
exactly.
Obama? So, it really wasn't a debate about the debate. It was
That's right.
about something
Right.
else.
Right, and I guess I would suggest that the answer here is, in fact, to state established truths. And in this situation, there are some truths. And I think while the media in general did not do a particularly good job of it, as was pointed out by Frumkin and James Fallows and others, there were moments, there were bright moments. And so here's an example of, I think, a bright moment. So this was a front page story. The headline says, "Republicans back down, ending crisis over shutdown and debt limit." And in the, fifth paragraph or something, it says, the result of the impasse that threatened the nation's credit ceiling was a near total defeat for Republican conservatives. Now here's the important part. Who had engineered the budget impasse as a way to strip the new health care law of funding, even as registration for benefits opened. So this is not in the mouth of anyone. It's just being stated by a couple of reporters who were able to sound and be authoritative. And I think that is the answer.
I
Part
also
of the
think
answer.
in the presentations we saw, the second Obama was very rhetorical. But in the first setting, he goes to a point where he says, this is what happened 2 years ago, and he lists off a number of things that were facts. So what he did was he did what was classically done in law, which is you take a conclusion which is unacceptable to put forward, and you deconstruct it into its component parts of why this is in fact a risk to the U.S. And so that, I think, was classic presentation using a legal conclusion and the adversary system in the way that we would do it in the law. And I thought that was the most powerful piece in this whole discussion.
Well, the most powerful thing to me is having Warren Buffett say the world's going to come to an end. So.
Yes, going to an expert,
right.
which is actually
exactly.
Do you think that part of what we're dealing with here is the public became disinterested or remained disinterested because it's just presented as this slugfest, and how boring is yet another slugfest? And that I thought what you were going to say is that you can imagine a different outcome if the public really did understand what each of the players were seeking. Not that it's a put down to say that Boehner was in a really difficult position. And, some local coverage showed that there were, say, 2 local Republican congressmen in a given state, one of whom was saying, I wasn't sent to Congress by, my people of my district in order to shut down the government, sort of taking a shot at a more Tea Party type.
I was going to raise this point with you, Geneva. To what extent do you think it's journalists seeking out people who want to have conflagrations on TV to make the debate seem deeper than it is? In my experience with Congress, I go in and I find that an awful lot of people are very distressed with the bipartisan divide, which is very broad. They would like to see more congenial working out of things, and they're rather suppressed by both the leadership that wants to have the grand debate, Armageddon, and to a certain extent, the way the news media, especially TV, pumps up these arguments by taking the prophets who are probably not the most reliable on either side.
Well, certainly both are true. We have a political atmosphere and a journalistic atmosphere in which there's a really not unprecedented if we go back enough in history, but at a particular fever pitch.
I think the other question is, what are the two sides and who decides who the two sides are? So if you take something like an evolution argument, it looks like the two sides are evolution is true, evolution is not true. Whereas the two sides could easily be, can you say something against scientific fact for religious reasons, or can you not? And you could represent both of those sides. So I think what's not acknowledged is the political power of setting the line of the two sides of the debate to begin with, or believing that there's only one line that's being set. And so to me, that's a big part of the problem here.
Well, that's an interesting comment. And actually, we have a chance to test some of what you're saying in about 10 days when the President's Cancer Panel releases a report on papillomavirus vaccine. And the report has a lot of very sensible things. It imagines the future. You know, are we going to have a world in which young people are protected against these viruses and the cancers they cause, or are we not? Lays out the facts. But I wager that a lot of the news coverage is going to, you know, portray this debate about whether vaccines are safe, instead of dealing with, you know, the real problems and limitations of these vaccines and their incredible benefits of protecting a very large fraction of the population against cancer.
I certainly took notes that I know will be helpful to me as we think about that. And so I want to thank you so much for all that you have shared with us. And I want to ask if you have very brief closing wisdom to leave with the audience. Anybody? Don't have to. But if anything in particular occurs to you that you haven't said, or...
I'm very grateful to have been the token male here.
And
we felt it important.
Well.
Yes, we felt it important to deign to include a man. Anybody?
I think that it's just hard to know what it is and how to get to it, and how to know whether you've gotten there. I mean, that's what I took from what we talked about today.
I know I'm here as a representative of art and business, but my original studies were in political science and constitutional law, and I do often think that most political or social problems that are, especially if they're problems of conversation, which this is, can be solved with either education or campaign finance reform. That there's either a hidden economic question or an education question of how people are brought into whether it's learning the first and second gears of a medical problem to be able to talk about something that's important at an Audubon level of speed, or whether it's how to bring in the ability to read all the different sides of the story. So I guess I go back to something like the Federalist Papers and the idea of factions, that obviously there are power dynamics and responsibilities that go with being a journalist and being a voice of authority or having a megaphone, but that I think the quality of conversation that exists around that, and the ability of groups of people to have opinions and to meaningfully discuss them is the direction I would go.
And I guess I would say that I think it's extremely important for journalists to have the courage to seek and to state what is as true as they can get, and not just allow conflicting voices to be what the story is.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, Geneva, I'd like to thank you for leading this fabulous panel and all the panels. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. You are a terrific group, and we are delighted that we were able to have this great conversation. Thank you to you all. You were terrific. Thank you.